I want to welcome everybody to another Camera Club of Art Zoom webinar. I hope everyone continues to stay safe and healthy and is doing well in this time where we're mostly stuck at home anyway. This is the third webinar in the series on photography composition, tools and concepts. And as we all know, the most critical ingredient for consistently creating captivating images is seeing and creating creativity, composing with creativity. Seeing creatively is a learning talent, and it takes some practice, but anyone can learn to see more creatively. So this evening, let's continue to look at some of the practical ways that we can incorporate another composition technique in our remarkable images. So I know I'm repeating myself, but let's start again by defining composition, what it's all about. At the risk of oversimplifying this key component of photography, composition can be summarized as how we frame our subject in our image and how we decide what to include and what to exclude, sometimes more important, in our photograph. So our composition is greatly linked to our creativity, our personal perspectives, and our understanding of design principles that we choose to apply to our photography. As photographer Ian Plant suggested, the goal of creative composition is to encourage our viewers to linger a long time in our image. A unique and compelling composition of an interesting subject captured with the necessary camera technique will more often than not be one of those images that your viewers will love to linger in. In these series of webinars, we've been breaking down a few key components of composition in a way that can be easily applied to our photography. And we've discussed the rule of thirds so far and negative space last week. And tonight let's explore some practical ways we might incorporate what's known as secondary frames. My hope is that you will get a few tips that are easily practiced so you might incorporate secondary frames in your compositions a little more often than you might now. So you may already be familiar with the concept of secondary frames, or sometimes called subframes, or some authors call it frame within a frame. And some authors also occasionally oversimplify the concept by labeling it a picture in a picture. Although the concept is pretty simple to understand, creatively applying some multifaceted secondary frames, which we'll discuss, is not often appreciated. So if you're not familiar with the concept, secondary framing is a composition technique where you compose elements within the scene to create a secondary frame within the image frame, that is, inside your viewfinder frame. The primary role of a secondary frame is to draw your viewer's eye to the primary subject. However, as we will see, the impact of secondary frame can be dramatic when you include it in your image. The classic example of a secondary frame is photographing a subject through a physical window or door or architectural feature, as you see in this image. This is an effective way to call attention to your main subject. But what do you think? Is your eye drawn immediately to the bearded gentleman in this image? And what do you think about the secondary frame telling you a little more about the story? Does it do it for you? So we could review many classic examples of secondary frames where I've photographed the subject through a physical window, door, or archway. I would guess that many of you have done the same thing as well. We're going to spend less time discussing these types of secondary frame examples And since they're pretty common, using an architectural feature is certainly an effective way to focus your viewer on the hero of your photograph. And I encourage you to continue to use this type of secondary frame in your photography. But let's discuss other opportunities for incorporating secondary frames in our remarkable photographs. A secondary frame can enhance an image in many more ways than just focusing your viewer's gaze. The shape of the frame and how it relates to the image story can significantly impact viewer interest while keeping your viewer focused on your subject. The secondary frame that relates to your story can be especially effective when the subject is small and surrounded by a whole lot of details. A well-placed secondary frame can provide viewers with a greater context, giving the image a sense of time or place. And for instance, framing the woman surfer here in a unique frame shape of the sea grape trees and the dune boardwalk does more than just focus our attention on the woman. It also helps tell the story about her and the beach environment she is stepping into. This secondary frame breaks up the rectangular image frame, that is what you see inside your viewfinder, while still telling your viewers a lot more about the where, the when, and the what of this surfer's story. By the way, it has been my limited experience with magazine editors is that they love to break up the static rectangular feel of their magazine covers. What they do is they like to see an image that contains an irregular secondary frame around their primary subject. So you may want to take a look at some of your magazines and see how many of them use this, use in their cover images a secondary frame concept. This is a Space Coast Living magazine. They picked up one of my photos to use as a cover for their Discover Space Coast special edition in 2016. They used the same image of the woman that was surrounded by a unique secondary frame. So organizing your composition with a creative secondary frame goes beyond just creating a simple picture within a picture. We are not only calling attention to our main subject, we are also impacting how the viewer interprets and feels about the whole story you're presenting. For instance, notice how this secondary frame adds a sense of depth and dimension of this photograph. Do you agree the secondary frame also adds some sort of context and interest to the image? So now that we have a better understanding of how secondary frames can make our images more compelling, let's explore what we can use to serve as secondary frames that goes beyond the most basic physical elements of windows and doors. The possibilities are limited only by your imagination. There are all sorts of secondary frames you can use. So one of the things I would suggest is look for opportunities to use multiple secondary frames within one another to create an amplified sense of this depth and interest you can get from frames. This technique may be especially valuable when the main image is small, as in this image. I don't know if you can hardly see it, the person way up there at the top of this spiral staircase. So spiral staircases, tunnels, and caves are prime places where this multiple secondary frames may be present. Also look for opportunities to compose leading line elements that lead your viewer to your secondary frame. And again, adding an amplified sense of depth and interest to your photography. The foreground and the leading line elements also give your viewers a sense of being present in the image. You can experiment with the depth of sharpness to capture your secondary frame in either soft or sharp focus. different frame sharpness can be effective in different images, and frames made up of elements with many details, as in this example, may be more effective if you render it in soft focus to try to eliminate some of those distractions. Here's another example of a secondary frame that's rendered in soft focus, but also of a unique shape behind our main subject here, adding some interest and depth to the image. You can look for opportunities to compose images with multiple secondary frames side by side, each frame with unique subjects in it. The secondary frames may contain different or complementary stories, like in this image taken at SeaWorld. You can experiment with the position of your secondary frame within the image. Don't be hesitant to place your secondary frame so it extends beyond one or more of the edges of your image frame. Your viewers will complete the frame in their own mind's eye. That you don't have to complete it for them. There are several frames in this image. How many do you count? Anybody know? What I want to know is, did you include the young lady's sunglasses? How do you think they might help a viewer guide them right to her face? They would be included in a secondary frame as well. Remember, secondary frames do not have to extend all around your subject. Even one edge of a secondary frame can force your viewer's eye to your subject. As some authors would call the tree in this image, that is the tree that's in focus on the right, a compositional tool called a blocker. It's a specific name for a one-sided frame that extends to the edge of the image frame. The results are very much like negative space. It forces the viewer's eye to your subject, but it also breaks up the viewfinder frame or the image frame itself and provides a secondary frame edge, which adds some interest to your image. I think a secondary frame of this nature adds to the feeling and emotion of many portrait images. Speaking of portraits, a hat provides a great secondary frame, adding a little accent to your story while effectively adding extra focus on the face of your portrait subject. And a little side note here, no doubt you've heard me say before, photographers, get in the picture with your loved ones. Photos like this will probably be more valuable to your ancestors than, or to the people that come behind you, that is. So the next time you take a selfie, take a careful look at your background. You just might find some great frame elements to stand in front of to make them a little more interesting photo. I would encourage you to look for opportunity to use one or more conceptual elements, and we're talking about light or shadow or color as a conceptual element rather than a physical element, as a secondary frame that highlights your subject, as in this image. The contrast between the light and shadow forms a unique secondary frame. But be careful that you don't have areas of this nature that are not featuring your main subject or main character. Contrasting tones can easily be a distraction as well. Look for opportunities to combine physical elements with conceptual elements such as shadows and light and color, as we discussed, to form the borders of your secondary frame. In this image, you will find that the tree is framing the church on two sides, and the shadow in the foreground is framing the bottom. So we have a three-sided frame here. Some authors suggest that secondary frames can make a viewer feel a little voyeuristic, sort of peeking through the forest, if you will, into the scene. This photo feels a little like that to me. and I will let you decide how you might feel. But here we have a secondary frame made out of the tree as well as the shadow in the foreground. Finding frames in landscapes is especially fun for me anyway. You can often frame your focal point or scene with physical elements and conceptual elements, such as shadows, light, and color, as we discussed, to form at least a few borders of your secondary frame. And here we have the primary view I wanted viewers to focus on, surrounded by a frame on three sides. The trees on the left and right, and the fallen tree and the shadows and the rocks at the bottom. So adding a frame around the leading lines of the mountains and the sky reflection adds a greater sense of depth and dimension. You can look for opportunities to use contrasting tones, colors, or textures between your secondary frame borders, your subject, and surrounding elements, as can be seen in this image. Look for reflective surfaces such as mirrors or windows or puddles to form the secondary frame. You're likely to capture an image in the reflection that might not otherwise be viewed in the scene by most people anyway. Now we saw this image when we discussed accentuating space, but notice this is a great example of a unique frame being formed by the reflective surface of the puddle. Adding the secondary frame captures an image that might not otherwise be viewed by most people. You think this unique secondary frame causes viewers to linger a little longer in the image? Remember, that's our goal with composition. Notice that this image makes use of all three of the compositional tools that we've discussed so far. The rule of thirds, accentuating space, and as we discussed tonight, a secondary frame in the reflection. You can look for posters, TV, computer, or mobile device screens that contain an image that complements the surrounding scene or story. You know, they make very interesting secondary frames, especially in these days of high tech and cell phones and iPads that are everywhere. You can create secondary frames by underexposing or overexposing elements that create contrasting shadows or highlights between the secondary frame borders, your subject, and the surrounding elements, as can be seen in this image. Another example of exposing for the highlighted elements created contrasting shadows and highlights between the secondary frame borders, the main focal point in this image, and the surrounding dark sky. Composing using secondary frames can be a powerful way to make your images even more remarkable and interesting. You may have a list of ideas to experiment with now, but use your imagination and be open to the secondary framing opportunities that you find. Use them when they work, avoid them when they don't, and combining secondary frames with other composing techniques can be the difference between an ordinary good image and an extraordinary one. Somebody said, Cheryl says, Chuck, did you Photoshop out all the people from the lighthouse picture Peggy's Cove? No, Cheryl, I got up very, very early to capture that photo. So there were no people around, but I know what you mean. It is very busy most of the time at Peggy's Cove. Like all compositional tools, there's no right or wrong way to use the secondary frames, only what feels right to us as the artist. The key is to consider the power of secondary frames to convey context to your story while calling attention to your primary subject. So I'll close by saying have fun with secondary frames. I hope you practice and experiment with the many opportunities we've discussed tonight and make good use of this powerful compositional tool. Thanks again for attending our third Camera Club of Brevard Zoom webinar. I hope you picked up a couple of tips on how you can apply secondary frames to your creative photography. And I hope to see you at our future webinars. As always, keep shooting, and may only the most remarkable images be yours. And let me close also by saying I'd love to have your feedback, either based, what you enjoyed or what you would like to see going forward. You can feel free to email us at info@ccbrevard.com. I would appreciate your feedback.